now, so that we have a sense of all the rich perspectives and reflections that we can learn from. Okay, so I think we'll start with everyone feeding back into what each group did. James, do you want to?
Go on then. So let's mix it up a bit. So, well, I think it makes sense probably actually to start with the folks doing the project planning phase first. So did someone from that group pick someone to report back? Who's going to do that?
Yeah, me.
That's Leah. Okay, cool. Go for it there.
Great. So I guess firstly, when we're thinking about the third point, we were really thinking about Sarah's personal experience and the circumstances that may impact her ability to do the work that she needed to undertake. It seemed to kind of fall into emotional and cultural challenges, technical skills that may be a bit of a challenge there, and then maybe more practical things around equipment and stuff like that. So with emotional and cultural challenges, we were thinking, I guess quite obviously there'd be the impact of her own trauma to work through at the same time, while also dealing with the trauma maybe of the people that she was interviewing as well, and having that challenge there. Culturally, we're thinking there may be issues around whether she might need a chaperone to be in certain areas to make herself feel more comfortable, or people in her family to feel more comfortable with what she's doing. Then technical issues. So we were kind of thinking again, depending on the amount of training she has, there is kind of assumption from us as heritage professionals about people's digital literacy a lot of the time. So it did say that she maybe hadn't used a laptop a lot. So within the collecting of the information, using the laptop to save files of these interviews, there may be issues around that, and also maybe some anxiety around using different technology and equipment that she's not familiar with. And then and just other things like communication. It's with intermittent Wi-Fi, not being able to speak to people that maybe are supporting her in the team, and even just simple things like talking to the people that she's going to be meeting to interview. There could be issues around that. And then I think when we were thinking about we were kind of wrapping up, we were talking about how there's the ties between heritage and identity, and how important it is this work, particularly within the situation that they're in a conflict. The communities will be focusing on survival, and there might be a pushback against how important it is to actually undertake this work, but then also the fact that it's giving some people a sense of agency at a time that where they might not feel much at all. Yeah, if I've missed anything, I feel like my teammates can jump in, but.
Thanks so much, Leah. I think thinking about project planning and thinking about the challenges you talked about captures so much of things that I think we experience. One very small thing I was want to note is around things like assuming literacy. I think it's one of the things we also found was not just assuming literacy, but assuming kind of different cultures of using computing. So, I mean, we encountered things like people being used to have to download sort of illegal versions of software because of, say, restrictions on their ability to purchase software because of where they were located, for example, things like lack of access, not only because of financial reasons, but lack of access because of restrictions on people in certain countries buying American products, for example. And so that creates circumstances in which they get used to having viruses, for example, and viruses are a big part of their lives. And that's really different to what I expected to encounter. So it's not just about literacy, it's about a different world in which people are actually using the computing that looks remarkably similar to what we use on a day-to-day basis. Thank you. Can we turn then to the content creation group for a few reflections on the work that you did during the breakout? So just to recap for everyone, so the content creation group, we're looking at a page midway through the workbook, effectively, when people have gone from planning to a phase in which they're starting to make copies of intangible cultural heritage.
I admit we didn't actually allocate anyone to talk about it, but I can try and quickly summarize if the rest of my group are okay with that, and then you can jump in if I've missed anything. So admittedly, we focused more on more intangible concepts surrounding this workbook, I suppose, in terms of, for example, specifying why exactly they are documenting the content that they are. So a lot of our experiences were with cultures that have had their heritage kind of displaced in term from war or through colonization or these sort of things. So trying to have that balance between us coming in and being like, we want your data, and also in ensuring that they understand the value of their data, but also that they actually want to collect it as well, was something that we sort of discussed quite a lot in our group. And also the sort of collaborations that need to take place during the collection of data. So between, for example, the younger generations who supposedly would be collecting the data, and quite often those people who are holding the knowledge of heritage, which would be generally elders or older generations. So having something in terms of understanding potential trauma that could have happened through this, and how that might be what's the word, sort of spiked by certain questioning techniques, or anything like that. So how to avoid that. And I'm trying to think, there was something else, the sort of three main points that we discussed in general. Oh yes, and well, yes, so the choice of content. So why is it important to document what you are documenting, and what choices should be made during the documentation process in terms of like what value is given to specific aspects of it. Juan and Eleonora, feel free to jump in if I've skipped anything major. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, you summarized very well a very, very deep conversation we had, focusing on communities and young people who are in conflict territories, require sometimes, to pay attention to the pre-production of that content and reflecting about the purpose of doing this. And taking also on board that sometimes as a researcher or content producer, we also had to understand the risk of approaching people who are traumatized, and how we can negotiate that. Also understanding the cultural background that sometimes, we coming from another cultural background, we tend to oversee. And this, from Kuchetna, we had a wide experience of listening to people complaining about that. So we understand that listening is a very important asset for young people to learn and pay attention and create an authentic communication, thinking about collaboration and co-creation. We are not producing the content, we are co-producing the content. If I am a young person interviewing an old person or a person from another generation, she or he is the carrier of the cultural heritage that we're trying to preserve and document to produce the content. We both valuable assets in this process, and it's very, very important to think about respect and understanding that sometimes we as a researcher might not be aware of. So this is a very, very important thing for us to always advocate and engage when we talk to young people in these particular territories.
Thank you so much, Tilly, Juan. And it certainly is making me think back to particularly a workshop we ran with the University of Duhok and some of the young people there speaking about effectively their motivations being around, we've lost everything, being from Kurdistan, and then trying to use these workshops as ways of recapturing parts of things they feel they'd lost. Maurice, before we move to the next group, did you want to speak briefly about sort of anything about sort of particularly choices around content? Because I think we did steer them to some extent through the wider project, I guess, even if we weren't through the digital presence, through this particular part of it.
Absolutely. And I think maybe Sophia would also like to interject on some of these points in a minute. There are three things that where there are tensions here. The first is that we recognize that they are young people, so they have a great deal of potential, they have a great deal of energy and a great deal of wanting to see that they have a future in a context where, as you mentioned, they've lost everything. So the balance between recognizing the trauma, recognizing that these are not people who would have just got on with their ordinary lives. There's been massive disruption. On the other hand, the agency dimension that many of them would tell us in not using the word humanitarian, but the essence of what they're saying alluded to it, is that they don't want to be treated like humanitarian charity cases. They want to be able to feel that they are we call them heritage gatherers to give them a professional role. You are doing something for the community. And that for us, we gave them certificates from IDS so that they would feel that, this is something they can add to their CV. It's so important that this is not just community service, but they're doing something extremely important in terms of a role, a purpose in life. So it's that balance between recognizing the specifics, the particularities of coming from a context of extreme disruption, but also the hope, the sense of purpose that requires that you see yourself as a professional. So that's in terms of agency and approach. The second is the workbook was so important for us because we wanted to try and incorporate participatory approaches to heritage in terms of storytelling and situational analysis. But of course, as you all know, heritage was never supposed to be a set of to do, you tick the box and you move on. And for us, I remember there was one point it's been an ongoing experimentation, not in learning, but in 2019, James and I were in a workshop in Egypt. And there was this idea of why this is important. And people were beginning to kind of wander off mentally. And we immediately incorporated participatory methods, which is think of situations in which you've gotten this amazing data, but suddenly it's lost. How has it gotten lost? And what are the consequences of its loss? And as young people, develop for us skits. Skits are sort of mini theatrical scenario setting where you play out what's happening. And they came to life all of a sudden. Everything to do with why preservation counts came into life through these skits of, the massive drama. OMG, we've this memory stick has fallen in the mud. OMG, I left the memory stick in my jeans and mom put it in the washing machine. OMG, all of these situations, real life situations from their context came into being. So again, the way in which we can create these more dynamic where people the experiential, the personal experiential becomes so important to embed it. But could I just say one of the failures, because, one of the things that we learned from our, failures, is from some of these skits, it appeared that some of these OMGs had to do with their accountability to us as their partners. OMG, we're going to be skimmed alive. Well, they didn't say skimmed alive, but something pretty close to, the implications of data loss for us. And then we sort of, how do you get them to navigate from OMG in terms of accountability to us as their partners to OMG accountability to their community? OMG, what it means for a community to lose this. Some of them conveyed this very powerfully in terms of, what does it mean in terms of my accountability to the future generations, to the people who've given us interviews and expect us to preserve it? So that's the kind of shift in power that we have to sort of think of, how do we get the accountability to be towards the community and not just towards us as their partners? Sorry to have taken so long.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maurice. And that's one of those stories that I think always sticks in my mind as well, that particular one around skits. can we move on to the documentation group to report back on things you reflected on during your breakout?
Yeah, so we had a few technical issues this morning, so that meant I came in late and missed quite a bit of it, but I'm going to try and cover what my teammates have discussed, and if I miss anything, I'm sure they can jump in on that. So they talked about having power backups for, like some of the hardware issues, and having somewhere to keep it safe is essential for her. And they also really liked the idea of explaining things to someone with visual impairments, which can help, not just in that specific scenario, but going forward with the documentation process. So we also they also talked about different sort of language that was used and how this has maybe been changing. So one example they've got here is not using the term white privilege, or also not using BAME anymore, and sort of changing as opinions change on that. What else have we got? And they also talked about having sort of wider networks in GLAM to help with sort of a decolonization network to give it its widest sense of meaning, and inbuilt training to build confidence around being okay with things being imperfect. And another one about reverse mentoring. I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in on anything I've missed there.
Oh, okay. Also, some of the things we talk about was issues to do with security, on issues to do with digital security, like to train Sarah on digital security, how to do backup of user work, and also orientation on using the gadgets, like for example, the laptop and the recording devices, for accurate and precise information, so that may not have information leakages. And also, lastly, one of the critical issues was to do about personal security, and also on power backup in the event that he wants to carry out some activities and then there is no sufficient power. So maybe some power banks will be of great interest to help. And those are some of the things that we talk about in our group for documentation. And also on the documentation process, one of the things we talk about on the documentation process was about detailed approach to the people with visual impairments, and we have also other disorders. For example, if it is a picture, let it be a full detail, and also the color of the clothes that someone is wearing, its complexion, height, etc. I think that's what we came across as a group. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, I think one of our great challenges with this work was trying to encourage people to both to think of the value of writing about cultural heritage, but also to do it in a kind of interesting way and to go beyond, I think, as you articulated, just seeing it as a job, but seeing it as a sort of something they were personally invested in. I'm really glad you picked up on the point about sort of thinking about, say, so we write in the workbook, a way to think about description, think about someone who is visually impaired and how you might describe it to them, but we also build in this character of Uncle Yusuf to go with Sarah, who, she's talking to him and she's exciting him about something she saw. And what we ended up very much by working with communities was trying to find models where they'd sort of write things that excited them in a way about the heritage they captured as a starting point for documenting it, because trying to start with sort of some basics ended up with some very sort of routine and not very interesting ultimate descriptions of the things that people have created. Sophia, does anything you want to add here about some of the work that we've done around descriptions? Because certainly in this section of the workbook, when we talk about how to write about interviews, for example, that's something that you contribute a huge amount to and experience to.
Yeah, I would say it was kind of definitely it was the biggest challenge we had, I would say, in terms of the documentation and the preservation of the heritage. They were very, very active in going and doing the interviews, recording interviews, submitting them and uploading them, but capturing the why this heritage is there and why it's valuable, why this story, this topic that this interview focuses on, and trying to get them to describe that in a way that would give somebody like looking at the archive an insight into what's in that interview and why it might be of interest or of value. Was definitely challenging. I'm not sure, at least in Iraq, that we really nailed it. I think it's the burden of labor, right, that we're also challenged by in terms of doing very participatory approaches and participatory methods, where young people, among studying, among homework, with their responsibilities to their families, it's a time-intensive project to go out and do interviews, to do transcripts, and they do receive livelihood support in for doing that, but still, you know, they're living in really challenging, complex circumstances with a lot going on in their lives. So then to find that time for them to see the value in sitting down and describing what they've done, that's, I think, where the kind of the disconnect comes, because they've done it. They're like, we've done the work. Why do we then go on? Why are we showing it? It's there. So I think that was probably, at least in looking at the archives that we've got from the Iraqi young people, perhaps one of the most challenging aspects. It does feel like that documentation process adds another layer on top of even kind of the capturing, the recording, and the archiving and the uploading side of things as well. And so we tried to do it in this kind of trying to get them to think about it in a more creative way, but also in a circumstance where often they would have preferred just, these are a list of things you need to write about. And that's kind of what a majority of them did end up doing, was kind of, these are the kind of core details of what I've captured, as opposed to that really engaging element. So I don't know if there's any advice or suggestions as well in the room about experiences of how to do that and learning to share in response to that. But we started thinking about it in this way in the workbook, but I think there's still work to develop it further, potentially. Well, definitely as well.
Thanks, Phil. And I think one of the things we really learned from this project, by looking at the way in which sort of documentation is described in the literature around preservation, archiving, museum studies, whichever kind of fields we're looking at more broadly, is that they're very much cultural, and they're very much sort of, there is a culture of how things are done, and actually explicating that culture can be quite challenging. And so working in these communities, we were trying to generate their own culture of how to do it, to get slightly away from the kind of like fill this in kind of way of doing it, and try and sort of enable them to be kind of slightly more creative. And as you say, Sophia, it wasn't always successful, but in some cases we did get some slightly nicer ways of describing, alongside getting the key details we needed. I'm mindful of time and the fact we have 10 minutes and that DCDC is hard stop and will kind of cut us off at past. Towards the end of the descriptions of the task, which you all so kindly participated in, we mentioned at the bottom if you had any questions for us, and we'd be happy to kind of field any questions that you have broadly about our work. We also asked you to put some stuff on a Jamboard, and to think about concepts that might hinder Sarah in her work or benefit Sarah in her work, and some people have sort of put some stickies on there. So I wondered if we could just use the last few minutes to either give you an opportunity to ask us any questions, or if you'd rather sort of just talk a little bit about why you put your sticky on the Jamboard where you did put it on the Jamboard. So either or, essentially, at this point. If you could use the Zoom features to put your hand up if you want to come in, and I will invite you in to speak.
And it might be worth, James, just taking a cluster of that's the wrong word, but you know, a group of questions, and then we can take a couple of minutes each to sort of reflect back into them.
Rachel.
Hi, thank you. It's just been amazing hearing about the project this morning, so thank you very, very much for that. I had a question for Sophia, actually, if that's okay. It was just your sort of reflections just there about encouraging the young people as part of the project to then express, why the value of the heritage that they had collected. Do you think is it the methodology in terms of getting young people to write things down, that was maybe the issue, or was it something else? I mean, I was just thinking, I wonder if they had sort of created short films to explain the value, but of course, obviously, you'd have to think about what you want to say first, so there still might be an element of writing it down, but that maybe it's the format of that maybe if that was different, it might encourage a different response. Or yeah, just wondering if you had any thoughts around that, because you obviously spoke fantastically about how in these sorts of projects we all have to kind of meet the people that we're working with where they are in the first instance, and so sort of adapting to learning styles and that sort of thing. So whether it's possible perhaps to capture that value in a different way, because I know that we've struggled with those sorts of things as well in projects that we've done. Sorry, long question.
No, thank you so much, Rachel. I think it's definitely something really worth thinking about, because definitely the writing, whether that was transcripts or in terms of record, like the record keeping, was something that the young people did find a barrier from my experience of engaging with them. I think the challenge then, and also because in terms of technology, they're so much more comfortable doing things on their phone. So if they can take a video on their phone or a voice note on their phone or something like this, it's much more accessible to them than having to type on a laptop, which, I mean, we take for granted now sort of how quickly we type, but if you're not used to using keyboards, it can take for anyone doing a transcription takes a really long time. But then time in terms of typing, if that takes you longer because you're not so familiar with it, definitely. I suppose the balance then is in terms of people accessing the archives, is that it's easier in some ways to see that kind of written documentation than to go on and click and listen or watch a film. But in some ways, maybe it's more engaging as well, maybe to watch a film of somebody explaining why what this is captured in this sort of material here might be of interest or relevant to do those short snippets. So I think that would definitely be a really interesting thing to explore and experiment with, and yeah, really, really valuable. Thank you for that.
Just to add very quickly, Melanie said we can go off by 5 minutes if we need to, which is great. So I know Maryse wants to come in, and then we'll have the questions, comments from both Jessica and Eleonora, and then we'll respond to those, and then we'll try and close up. Okay.
Very, very quickly, there was a very strong visual element to this project, which actually was when we did our evaluations, the visual element was the one that got people most excited. So they produced digital storytelling, and the digital storytelling is part of the participatory development methodologies, which puts the person at the center because he or she is the narrator, and they collate the pictures. It's a bit like a storyboard to go with the story they want to say. And in all evaluations, Egypt and Syria, Egypt and Iraq, we couldn't do it in Syria for reasons to do with logistics, but all the evaluations, over 200 students, this was the dimension that they said they enjoyed most, the production of digital stories. In Egypt, there was a dimension because it was the oldest and most advanced of the 3 projects. We helped them produce 2 things: vlogs, where they say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so from so-and-so community. I'd like to tell you about so-and-so and so." Or they would be doing interviews. And then these interviews we had on on a transnational television station. So they became almost like correspondents. And in both cases, these were the elements that they enjoyed most. It was the verbal narration of their stories, which they, in all cases, they in the evaluations, they said these were the elements that they found themselves most empowered with and through.
Thanks so much for coming in there, Maurice. I'll hand it to Jessica and then to Eleonora, and then we'll have some comments based on both questions or comments.
Thank you. So my question was actually about the participatory approaches to the kind of workshops you're running. We're planning to run some workshops both with kind of technical and academic people at one level, so definitely with a shared understanding, and then also another workshop which would be more broad, so sort of senior trustees, etc., as well as staff members from the region, ourselves, kind of a much more of a mixed bag, but to try and get at these ideas of what's the point of the heritage archiving, why are we doing it, who are we doing it for, and actually use those discussions to shape our strategy moving forward and what we make decisions about priorities about. So yeah, maybe Maurice, if you could speak a little bit more about which participatory approaches you found most useful, yeah, or any readings that we might be able to do on that, that would be very appreciated. Thank you.
And Eleonora.
Hello. Mine is more kind of a note than probably a question, and I think Maurice is just to reply a little bit in terms of the use of blog to document and the visual aspects of the project. But I was wondering in terms of documentation, because of course when we talk about documentation, we talk about document that is shared in a traditional way. And what I find in some communities is actually working especially with students, young students in other countries, is just they found a WhatsApp group maybe the most immediate way and easiest way to document it. And if I was asking them to do something in a way that I thought it was the best way to do it, for my purposes, didn't actually work and engage them. But then when I changed and shifted, oh, could you just post this on our Facebook group? Oh yeah, sure. And then it's how the engagement works. So I was wondering if you experiment anything in this sort of way and what might be in the reply.
Thanks so much, both. I'll hand over to Maurice, and then I've got a comment a bit about WhatsApp as well, so which Maurice might remember.
I think also I'd like to hear from Sophia, because we used WhatsApp a lot in Iraq, and it was the main mechanism of communicating. On participatory methods, I think we always started with heritage, on the personal experiential, who you are, what it means to you. But before we spoke about even using the word heritage, in order for them to reflect on their personal life, we used a method called the Rivers of Life methodology. You will find it on the internet, and it's very clearly explained. It was wonderful because it allowed people to delve in who they are and what who they are means to them before we go into even if they are members of the community, there's still an extractive dimension. So the Rivers of Life helped on a personal dimension, but also helped to communicate to them that oral heritage or oral histories is not about capturing someone's CV. It's about the waters flowing in someone's life, and you are helping someone look back at where the stones and mountains and rocks were on the river and where the sun shone on the river. So it's also helping them move from a CV kind of approach to oral history to one where it's more dynamic. So I would strongly recommend the Rivers of Life because they enjoyed it so much. We also used it afterwards as a participatory monitoring and evaluation mechanism to get them to talk about what transformed them along the journey in heritage gathering. So that would be my number one for getting a reflective purpose, for getting them to understand oral heritage, but also for monitoring evaluation purposes. The second one, which I cannot emphasize enough, is the digital storytelling, because then it's a short video of 3 minutes that they can then share along, along with people. And 3 minutes it's not quite the 30-second TikTok, but it helps a lot. So I'll stop there, and I think I'll let James and Sophia answer the other question.
Yeah, thanks, Breeze. I mean, I wanted to briefly come in on WhatsApp actually, because it was quite, one of the things that we observed that was quite interesting was obviously people using these kind of apps. And one of our challenges at times of some of the work that we did was that people would say make recordings on apps on their phone, which you couldn't get the data off. And that one of the things we were trying to do as part of this work was kind of give people steps where they think about which sort of software they're using, so they don't make bad choices that later means they can't preserve that material. WhatsApp was interesting as well, because one of the things we tried to communicate was the idea around sort of keeping lots of copies sometimes as a way of creating security. And sharing on WhatsApp was one thing that people were really kind of used to. At the same time, we did find quite quickly that you end up with a lot of sort of, shall we say, quality degradation. It sort of gets shared once and shared twice and screenshotted, and before you know it, you end up the thing that they say they're looking after is actually a kind of multiple way down the line poor version of an image, which is fine in a way, but was one of those challenges that we definitely encountered. So sort of getting that balance right between sometimes trying to encourage, well, in this case, I think we should be using a slightly more formal approach to trying to ensure that people could use the technologies they were more familiar with was really kind of interesting to kind of work through. Sophia, did you want to say anything final about WhatsApp and other kind of tech challenges, particularly in Iraq, before we close up?
Yeah, I mean, I would say our approach was very much just using multiple channels to capture everything. So we had the kind of the WhatsApp aspect of it, both as a communications tool between groups and their coordinators, with myself and Marie's as well. So we had that direct connection to the young people, and then also for the sharing of some of the heritage they'd captured, for example, the digital stories. But then I would also go, for example, with a hard drive and physically collect the heritage that they captured as well as kind of uploading it onto a secure online platform. The challenge with that being, especially with internet connections, that it would take a very, very long time to do, and it would get disrupted and things wouldn't get uploaded properly, which is why the hard drives was also really, really necessary. So we had to take that sort of three-pronged approach to capturing what the work that they had done, and again through that idea of accountability to their communities and to the people that had shared their stories with them and given their time, and also for the work and time that they put into it as well, really emphasizing that, yeah, this is why we're doing three levels of this, not just WhatsApp, not just uploading online, but also the hard drive as well.
Thank you so much. So we're over and out of time. I just wanted to thank everybody for their participation today and for your sort of positive approach to the tasks that we asked you to think about. I'll keep the Google Doc available for as long as you need. So if you do want to find the links to the various work that these projects have been undertaking, then some of it will be through there. I'm sure all of us are relatively findable online as well. So if you want to chat to with Marie's, for example, about sort of rivers of life and participatory approaches, I'm sure Marie's wouldn't mind also sort of responding to anything in reasonable time when we can get to it. But apart from that, I think all that remains to say is thank you so much for taking part today. The recording that's been made of this part of the session, we're not going to share it publicly or anything. It's just for our purposes. Risa's just put her email in the chat. And I think, I'm not sure exactly what we'll do after this session in terms of the next actions, but we'll certainly be using it to report back to our funders about some of the ways in which the project is engaged with the wider kind of sector and those communities. So thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.